Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. I wish my newsletter was more regular than it was. So if you do sign up for it, accept my apologies now. We're going to very lightly touch on Parshat Metzora, but we're mostly going to take a journey a little bit through the Haftarah and some other sources that I think are interesting. What I will say is, in Parshat Metzora, which is often paired with the one that comes from before it, is very much talking about a lot of the sort of more very specific rules that show up in the Tanakh. In the second half, talks about a lot of the relationships that are inappropriate, and the first half very much talks about it's very temple practice in general. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about those details, because I think there's something really important that happens in this week's Haftarah. It's Shabbat Agadol. It's the Parsha, right? The Shabbat right before Passover, and there's something that shows up in that Haftarah that I think forces us to look at the Parsha in a new way, particularly when we talk about temple and temple sacrifice. So what I'm going to do is the following: I'm going to share my screen, but before I do that, I'm going to drop in the chat the source sheet and my website for those people who are interested in that. And I'm going to share my screen to talk as we get started. Can everybody see this? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Cool. And if you prefer to look at it in the chat, please do so. And it happens that we're learning we read from the Book of Malachi this week. And in the first part, it sort of jumped out to me something that we see in other places as well, but I think is really important. So we're talking about in Parshat Metzora these rules about what we sacrifice and how it gets sacrificed and how did this work or whatever. And then we have this text from Malachi, and I'm going to read it for you. And I'm going to just read my sources in English for the most part. There's a few where I've removed the Hebrew altogether. Feel free to look them up more deeply if that speaks to you. But first, and this is the prophet, I will step forward to contend against you, and I will act as a relentless accuser against those who have no fear of me, right? The prophet is speaking on behalf of God, who practice sorcery, who commit adultery, who swear falsely, who cheat laborers of their hire, who subvert the cause of the widow, the orphan, the stranger, said the Lord of hosts. For I am the Lord, I have not changed, and you are the children of Jacob, you have not ceased to be. And we could have a whole conversation about whether or not God changes or not for today, but certainly an interesting turn of phrase. From the very days of your ancestors, you have turned away from my laws and not observed them. Turn back to me, and I will turn back to you, Lord of hosts. But you ask, how shall we turn back? And then this is the line that jumped out to me. Ought a human to defraud God? Yet you are defrauding me. And you ask, how have we been defrauding you? In tithe and contribution. You are suffering under a curse, yet you go on defrauding me, the whole nation of you. Meaning to say, and we see this in other prophets as well, we do some parts of engaging in practice, and in the prophetic tradition, it's often temple sacrifice and tithes and things like that, but we don't do all the other things that we're supposed to do, which is treat each other with kindness and justice. And I think this is part of how we need to understand all of these laws in Metzora, which is, what are we supposed to do with these details a little bit? How are we supposed to hold them? And I want to pull from the Rambam, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, who tells us something in his philosophical treatise, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, something specific about temple sacrifice. And he says the following. And this is very long, and I've cut out all the parts where he references the sources and stuff. This is just so you can understand sort of the main pieces. Again, feel free to look into it more deeply if that speaks to you. The Guide for the Perplexed, in part 3, 32.2, he says the following. But the custom which was in those days general among all people, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images, to burn incense before them. Religious and ascetic persons were in those days the persons who were devoted to the service in the temples erected to the stars, as has been explained by us, right? So basically, we've got this whole priestly system. The Book of Leviticus it sort of manifests that whole this whole tradition, right? This is a very common. This was a way that the Israelites, among other peoples that existed at the time, these things were all. This was normal. For this reason, and I'm reading in the text again. I'm right here for those people who are following on right there. For this reason, God allowed these kinds of service to continue. God transferred to God's service that which had formerly served as worship of created beings, meaning to say we used to serve idols, but now we're serving God in the same way that we would have served those idols, of things imaginary and unreal, and commanded us to serve God in the same manner. Meaning to say, right, we used to serve idols, that was the sort of normed way in which we would do it, and God basically said, don't serve the idols, serve me, but do it exactly the same way. And then he says the following, and this is the sort of in the next paragraph, he references all sorts of sources. He says, and now I turn to my theme, as the sacrificial service is not the primary object of the commandments about sacrifice, while prayer, supplications, prayers, and similar kinds of worship are nearer to the primary object. Now, philosophy I wouldn't suggest is my strongest suit in general, but the main thrust of his argument is basically prayer, self-reflection, supplications. These are the things that God actually wanted, rather than the sacrifices themselves. And so if we go back to the prophetic tradition, which I think for the book of Malachi, which is, I think, mirroring this in such a meaningful way, God doesn't want us to sacrifice in truth. God wants us to support the widow, the orphan, the stranger, not to commit adultery or to swear falsely. And then we come back to this question of defrauding God. Now, in the text, in the Hebrew text, the root is kuf bet ayin, which comes from, according to the note, from a verse in Genesis in which Esau is talking about Jacob and the way Jacob walks through the world. It struck me, a different Hebrew word, but the same English word, from this concept of fraud that we see in Bava Metzia. And before I sort of go into it, Bava Metzia, for those who may be not familiar, is a section of the Talmud. Talmud has 6 orders, right? So imagine you go to the library, you've got the Dewey Decimal System, it's got these different categories of subjects. And in the Talmud, it's got 6 orders. And Bava Metzia, this section of the Talmud, comes from a section called Nezikim, which is all about damages, right? What happens if I hit your car with my car and, we've got to figure out how to pay each other or whatever. So that's the kind of stuff that shows up in here. And then we have this, and this section in Bava Metzia is all about fraud, the way we fraud and defraud one another. And then it says something incredibly interesting. It says, the sages taught, it was written, you shall not mistreat one person, their colleague. And you shall fear God, I am the Lord your God, right? So it's a quote from the book of Leviticus. And the Tana explains, the verse is speaking with regard to verbal mistreatment, ona'at devarim, verbal fraud. And the Braita, the section from the early part of the Talmud, says, do you say that it is speaking about verbal mistreatment? Or perhaps it's only talking about monetary mistreatment. Or perhaps maybe it's only talking about exploitation in products and monetary exploitation, none of which are good, by the way, right? We're not suggesting, it's not like there's a hierarchy of which one is better or worse, but just that they're all bad. Perhaps this verse, you shall not mistreat one person, their colleague, is referring to one of these or not the other. When it says in a previous verse, you shall sell to your colleague an item that is sold, you acquire from your colleague's hand, you shall not exploit your sibling. Right, so meaning to say, we have this other verse that seems to tell us it's about sales, right? So maybe we're really just talking about the way we defraud each other in sales. In that verse, monetary exploitation is explicitly stated. How do I know that mistreating one person, their colleague, is referring to verbal mistreatment? And it goes on to say, and we're going to give a few examples, and there might be a few things in here you will have heard before, and now you'll have a source for them. How so? If one is penitent, if one person had done something wrong and they've now done tshuva, You may not say to them, remember your earlier deeds, right? Hey, remember the way that you used to do bad things? That would be considered ona'at devarim, this verbal fraud. If one is a person who is converted or a child of converts, you may not say to them, remember the deeds of your ancestors. Meaning to say, we're not supposed to remind people of their history before they converted, right? For those who have converted to Judaism, you're a Jew. Once you've converted, you're a Jew, right? And you're not supposed to be reminded about, your previous history. That would be considered verbal fraud, according to this. If one is a convert and they came to study Torah, and that you may not say to them, does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and animals and wounds that had caused them to die within 12 months, right? All these things that are not permitted to eat, are not kosher, they are treif. And repugnant creatures and creeping animals, this person who used to do all of these things, they now come to study Torah that comes from the mouth of God. That would be considered verbal fraud. And here we see another example. If torments or afflicting a person is suffering, if illness is suffering, if they have to bury their children, God forbid, you should not treat them the way Job's friends treated Job, who they themselves said, is it not your fear of God, your confidence, your hope in the integrity of your ways? Remember, I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent. Meaning to say, you probably sinned. This is your own fault. You weren't faithful enough. You didn't do the actions well enough. Not a great pastoral response, if I may say so. But here, right, would be considered verbal fraud. And then lastly, I'm not going to read this one in full. It gives various examples here of, the way you might treat someone poorly when it comes to talking about business. Right? You shouldn't, Rabbi Yehuda right here in the middle, you shouldn't cast your eyes on merchandise for sale, creating the impression that you're interested at a time when you do not have the money to purchase it. Meaning to say, if you go into a store, you're trying on all sorts of clothes, but you're not going to buy anything, that might be in a fraudulent way of walking through the world. And then lastly, this classic example, which is, actually, I have one more paragraph before I get to that. Rabbi Yochanan says that the verbal mistreatment is the verbal mistreatment greater than monetary exploitation, and it talks about why that may or may not be the case. And in particular, this is the line that I thought was so powerful. This verbal mistreatment affects one's body, but that monetary exploitation affects one's money. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says this monetary exploitation is given the restitution, right? You can always pay back, but verbal mistreatment is not given restitution. You can't fix it. And then this is the part that people may have heard before, which is the Gemara relates that Tana, an early Mishnaic teacher who recited the Mishnah and Braitot in the study hall, taught a Braita before Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Anyone who humiliates another in public is as though they are spilling blood, right? That their face will become red or that they will become pale, depending on the example, and that's effectively as if they had died. I know that was a lot of examples. I'm going to turn off my share screen for a moment so I can look at your faces. All of that is to say, right, we have this quote from Malachi, right, which is, should human beings defraud God? We have this whole conversation about what does it mean when we walk through the world? How are we potentially defrauding people the way we walk through the world, the way we use our words? Now we know that our words can cause harm and defraud others. It's real. And it's just as powerful as the words that can come to heal and grow and empower others. We know from the book of Genesis, from Sefer Bereshit, that words create the universe. They create reality. The last time I taught here, I was reading an article about quantum physics, about how, if we will something, it's real. If we agree on its reality, it's real. And so I think it's really important that we think about how our words make a difference. How our words how we might be more thoughtful of the way we communicate with others. And so what I want to do is sort of use that as a lens to talk about freedom, It's going to be Pesach after all. I'm a rabbi. I gotta get in the pre-Pesach Torah in as best as I can. I want to offer the challenge, the idea, the definition that freedom is not only sort of the capacity to sort of make free choice, to not be hemmed in, to be in restricted by others, but that the way that we use language, not just with others but with ourselves, is a way that we can be free. Meaning to say that not only do we have the capacity to defraud God, as we've learned from the verse, we also have the capacity to defraud others with our words. I also think we have the capacity to defraud ourselves with the way we talk to ourselves. And I think the fundamental question, like truly in the universe, is the question of like, who am I? Who am I as a human being? And I think this is ultimately one of the most important questions we can ask. And I think part of what Passover can offer us is a model, a methodology, of way of interrogating that question of who we are and how we strive to walk through the universe. And so what I want to do is actually take a moment, we'll all do it like sort of silently on our own, to reflect on that question, who am I? How are the ways that I might speak to myself in a way that's not truly as honest as I want to be, right? Again, just to yourself. And before we do that, I want to offer you one of my favorite stories. It's probably apocryphal, but I want to use it as an example of the kind of thinking I want to encourage, which is the story of the Vilna Gaon. It's a famous Talmudist in Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. And in order to join his yeshiva, his academy, you had to effectively have studied all of Talmud before you walked in the door. But they would administer as tests where the students would come in, they would sit down and be given a piece of text. And then they would watch how that student approaches that text. The students that learned, that relied on the learning that they had done before were not accepted into the yeshiva. But those students who learned the text as if for the first time, it was that approach, that thinking, that angle, those students were the ones who were brought in to the yeshiva. And so I want to just take 10, 15 seconds of silence together for us to meditate on that question of who am I? How are the ways that I talk to myself honestly and the ways that perhaps I'm not so honest with myself? And I want to encourage you to use that beginner's mind as if for the first time framing to perhaps ask that question in a new way. It doesn't have to be verbal, it could just be in your own mind. And so I want you to we're going to take 15 seconds, and I want you just to ask that question. Who am I? How am I honest with myself? What are things that I could be more honest with? We're going to start now. Okay. Now, as we talk about this type of honesty, the way we see ourselves, I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting that when we're honest, we should be mean to one another, even if we're being honest, right? God forbid. But rather an awareness of who we are, how we present ourselves out in the universe, and that we should try and find alignment between who we are and who we are out in the universe to make those as close as possible, right? So such that we are not defrauding God or others or ourselves. And that freedom is the ability to be honest with yourself, that self-honesty, and the integrity to do that. Now I want to share a piece of, another piece of text or two. Just make sure I share the right screen here. Everybody see this? Thumbs up? Yes? Awesome. And it's this quote, which should sound familiar if you've spent any time with the traditional Haggadah. And if not, that's okay, you'll learn it today. It's a quote from the Mishnah. It says, B'chol dor v'ador, chayav adam lirot, you can see I've turned it blue, et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. The Tana of the Mishnah says, in each and every generation, a person is obligated lirot, to see et atzmo, themselves, ki'ilu, as if they themselves went out of Egypt. And then it quotes the verse, Shana Amar, V'higata levincha biyom hahu lemor, right? And you shall tell your child on that day, Ba'avur ze asa Hashem li b'tzeti mitzrayim. It's because of this that God did for me when I came forth from Egypt. And I'm just going to get really, really specific here. This verb lirot, that's blue, being translated as view themselves, right? That to see themselves, et atzmo, is in a form of the verb lirot, to see, that is a simple version. It's kal. It's a grammatical category of just the simple meaning of the word, to see. This is really important because in another version of this text that I'm about to show you, they don't use the same word. And you may have seen this before, you may not have. It's my favorite part of the Seder, since we're not all eating together this, next week. We'll have a little mini moment of Seder now, which is the Rambam once again, sort of sharing his Torah today, says something different. B'chol dor v'ador, so far so good, in every generation, chayav adam, a person is obligated, leheiraot, which is not the same word, et atzmot, themselves, ke'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In each and every generation, a person is obligated, leheiraot, to be seen, right? It's a passive verb, and here it's also being translated as to show themselves as if they themselves went out of Egypt. So now we have two different words that to talk about this way we present ourselves or present it, or how we look at ourselves. And then the Rambam continues, Shelo et avotenu bilvad, right? Ga'al ela af otanu goel ga'al. Which is to say that, the English doesn't include it, that's funny, that it wasn't just our ancestors only that were redeemed, but also that we ourselves were redeemed, right? So the Rambam spelled it out a little bit further, right? It's not just, the story is not just about the ancestors, it's about us also. And so what I want to do is just take a moment and then quotes another verse, a different verse. I want to talk about the difference between these words, lirot and leheiraot, because they're not the same word. And one word can make every bit of a difference, and especially when we're talking about the power of words, all the more so. And part of what I understand, the difference between these words, is that to see ourselves is about what is happening internally. To see myself as if having come out of Egypt is about what's happening inside my heart and soul, inside my mind. It's about my own personal lived experience, how I exist inside myself. And leheiraot, what the Rambam says, to show or to be seen, is about the type of freedom, the type of existence that we show to others. Because those aren't the same. Because sometimes we feel one way and we act another. I think part of what freedom is about trying to find the alignment between those. Again, drawing on how we act in the world, right? From the Book of Malachi all the way through this defrauding, all the way till this, is about trying to find consistency, alignment between who we are and how we act into the world. I think this part of this answers the question of what does it mean to be free? To be free is to be able to be in alignment, to be who you are wherever you are. Now, that isn't to say that you should, context does matter. The way I am with my friends or my wife or when I'm at work are not all the same. I'm quite certain my wife would be driven crazy if I always used my teaching rabbi voice at home. Pretty sure she would not be happy with that. So it's not to say that we shouldn't be different in various cases, but that they should always be us, ourselves. And so the question becomes, what does this look like? what do we do with this? Now that we're free, let's imagine we find alignment. What do we do next? Well, thankfully, the Haggadah and the Mishnah offer us language to understand this. Therefore, having seen ourselves as free, as having come out from Egypt, we are obligated to thank, to praise, to glorify, to extol, to exalt, to honor, to bless, to revere, and to laud the one who performed for our ancestors and for us all of these miracles. God took us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festival, to happiness, from darkness to great light, Me'avdud legula, from enslavement to redemption. And then, right, the Mishnah says, and we should say hallelujah, and then we would sing some of the songs right before dinner at the Seder table. And so if we pull all of this together for a moment, what free people do when they can be themselves is to be joyous, to be grateful, to be reflective, to be kind. Right? Malachi teaches us that God seeks from us to make justice in the world, that as free people we can make the world better. Bava Metzora teaches us that God seeks for that our words and our deeds matter, right? That we should be intentional about how we interact with other humans and other people, the world we make with that. The dichotomy between the Mishnah and the Rambam that we just looked at teaches us that our insides should be like our outsides, that we should strive for consistency how we walk through the world, how we go through the world. And that this Mishnah and the Haggadah itself is a reminder that freedom is our responsibility to be grateful, to be optimistic, to see that our ancestors' journey from darkness to light is a part of our journey, and that our individual journeys can live out this as well. Of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't challenges in life. Of course, there are many, but that the arc of our lives, that of our universe in the whole, in the totality, that we can strive for making, to living in a way that is full of integrity, full of gratitude, optimism, amidst challenge, difficulty, and narrowness. And so I want to just take this moment and thank all of you, to relay my gratitude of just being able to share some Torah together, and open it up for some discussion here. We'll spend 15 or so minutes hearing your thoughts. What I would like to do is encourage you to use the raised hand function if possible. It's under the reactions at the bottom of your Zoom. And I don't know if you're on your phone, exactly where that is, but it should be under reactions and then the raised hand function. And then our illustrious Julie will help call on you. And Esther, I see you waving your hand. We'll go for you first, and then Joanne will go to you next.
Okay. First of all, when you said lirot v'lehiraot, I was thinking of livnot v'lehibanot. The same thing.
Say a little bit more for those folks who may not understand the nuance.
Livnot is to build. Lehibanot is to be built.
Right. I mean, that's the power of those Hebrew roots, right? That you can play with those words.
And because it's Passover, I was thinking of last week's Haftarah of Yecheskel, of saying we have to come back to the country.
Great.
But the most important thing to me was that you talked about words and language. And to me, language is a very difficult thing, because when I communicate to you, I may think that I'm coming through, but what you see and what I say are completely different things, except, as the Rav Kook said, when he talked about Torah, that it parallels it to the 5 books of Moses, because in each one of the books there is part of Lashon Hara.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you, Esther. Yeah, I mean, that challenge of our intention versus how that intention is experienced is a challenge. Absolutely. We'll go to Joanne, and then Wendy, and then Don. Joanne, please.
Rabbi, thank you for your teaching this morning. It's very, very dynamic and inspirational, especially going into Pesach. I think I have a simple question, or I think I can ask my question in a simple fashion, and that is, this journey of alignment with the inside and the outside, super relevant in my personal life. And my question is, when I see a new way of behaving to bring that alignment into the reality of my relationships, is it wise to talk about it?
What's the it in that sentence?
I've made a decision to not attend a wedding because I cannot support the fashion of the wedding. It goes against who I am.
So I think, well, I'm not going to speak to your specific situation, but I do think that two things have to happen simultaneously. The first is that we need to be understanding about who we are and our boundaries, right? Like this is my Jewish learning is so great at creating like a non-denominational pluralistic space. And as I understand pluralism is about understanding our own boundaries and respecting the boundaries of others. And so I think as we find alignment in ourselves, to do that, I'm going to use the word successfully, and of course success is like the hardest word to define ever. But in order to do this, I think successfully or effectively, we also need to be able to do that with kindness, right? That if I am full of integrity, but I'm creating harm in others, I think we will have lost the point. And so I think in general, when we try and find and communicate in any of our relationships, right, that we should strive to then be honest about how we feel about a particular thing, while also by knowing that we are not alone, that we are in relationship to others, and that their truths also matter. And so I think that's the way I would like sort of live those things two together, right? And certainly in conversations as my wife as my partner, and how do we communicate in a way that I can express who I am and what I believe and what I think, while also recognizing that she is a different person than me and she has her own beliefs and thoughts and ideas, and that those things are as valid as my own, and that those things don't have to necessarily, even if we don't agree, don't have to be a problem, if that makes sense. But that we should strive to do any of this with kindness. And I think part of that is what we see in Malachi, right? In Malachi, it's being framed in the form of justice, but that we can do this in a way that is not harmful to others. So that would be sort of in the broad strokes, specific situation notwithstanding. Wendy, and then Don.
Thank you, Rabbi. I immediately started to think when you gave us the opening quotes from Rambam about humiliating somebody in public is like spilling blood. I thought of the Chris Rock and Will Smith debacle recently, and everybody's focused on Will Smith and the slap and the apology. But in the Jewish tradition, are there any exemptions for jokes? Or is what Chris Rock did in public, Lashon Hara, is this, worthy of murder? What would be the Jewish interpretation of what Chris Rock's statement was? Please.
Sure. I have gone so far without having to have a single opinion on that thing. And I will continue to not share an opinion on that thing. But I will, I think, repeat the lesson I think is important, which is that there are ways to walk through the world that are not harmful, right? That are kind to others. And I was watching a video recently of an interview with Seinfeld. And I've been rewatching Seinfeld as of late, and not all the jokes really survived to the day, but a lot of them do. And one of the things he was saying in this interview, sort of two separate things in the interview, was about how he reworded a joke that would make people feel bad about themselves, and reworded it to have the same impact, positive impact, that people were laughing about the punchline of the joke, but in a way that sort of harmed no one. And so I think in general, there are ways to walk through the world in which we can be authentic and make jokes and be and have conversations with people, but in a way that is not harmful. And I think part of what we are experiencing in our culture, in the broad strokes, is learning how to do that better. Like every day is an opportunity to learn how to do that better. Things that would have been appropriate to say, 5 years ago, or 10 or 15 or 20 or 50, we know are not necessarily appropriate today. I'll give you an example. I was writing something around plagues, and I sent it to a friend just for some feedback, and she said, well, I'm not sure plague is really the angle you want to take while we're in the middle of a third year of the global pandemic. Okay, you're right. That probably is not gonna hit the way I want it to, right? So that's a way that being thoughtful about, there's that. And I'll say the last thing, which is that, one of the things my mom always taught me, and I've said this a million times, and I'm sure in future My Jewish Learning sessions, you will hear me say it again, because it's so true, which is that there's always a better way to say the thing you want to say. Always, right? In a way that's less angry or upset or frustrated or hurt, in a way that is more kind, more approachable, more open, right? That we should face things with questions and not assumptions. And so that would be my answer in broad strokes, which is we should always strive. We'll fail because we're humans, and and sometimes we have to go back and do tshuva and apologize and do the work of restitution. And with verbal fraud, as we learned from the Gemara, it's really hard to do that, if possible at all. And so that we should always be striving to do better. So again, not specific to that scenario, but just in the broad strokes of my thoughts. Don, and then I see Mark, and I see Joel's got his hand up in the screen. We'll get to you after Mark.
Rabbi, I want to thank you for your teaching today. I want to get back to what Esther said about language. The idea that people can have different views or inclinations about things that they study really are brought to a neck of a funnel with ritual. In other words, the ritual of perhaps worship can bring something that touches each person, that makes it common. There's a commonality that's pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things, I can't remember where everybody is from today, but the fact that we're from all over, learning together, right, is the power that we can find things to be unified around, and find things that bring us together. In this case, it's the study of Torah. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. Mark, and then Joel, and just inviting anyone else who wants to raise their hand to do so.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi, for the teaching also. My question is sort of a moral issue, but it's one of the times of the Seder of the Israelites in Egypt, and it seems pertinent now as then. So the question is, should we conform or rebel against oppression? If we rebel, we might die. If we conform, we will live. Should one sacrifice their freedom to live?
Only easy questions today, I guess. I don't think there's an answer to that question. And I'll say the following, which is that each of our lives are our own to live. We don't know the situations that each of us face and the way that we will face them. But I do think that we should strive to always fight oppressive factors, that we should always strive to make sure that our world is as equitable and as just as possible for as many people as possible. And sometimes that means that we don't like the result because people do things we don't like, but that means that they are not being oppressed. Like that's part of that. And I also think that sometimes you have to do what you have to do to survive. And both of those things are true, right? The beauty of the human mind is that we can hold two conflicting truths simultaneously. I'm reminded also of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva and the teachings in the Gemara remind us that there are only a few things in which you should basically, if you got to do what you got to do, the only way to survive is to eat pork, right? But that you shouldn't do a handful of things. There's like a list of things you shouldn't do, and he paid the ultimate price. He was burned at the stake by the Romans, right? And he certainly took the example of you fight oppression in the best way that you can, and his was in a nonviolent way individually in that example. But I think that the scenario of survival is a framework that we often use. Part of it is just our own experience as Jews in history, but that not everything is a survival category situation. Some of it is discomfort, and discomfort and survival are not the same. And so my inclination as an individual, right, each of you are going to do your own thing. My inclination as an individual is that whenever possible, we should strive to make life more just for as many people as possible, and to make life more equitable for as many people as possible. And we end up falling into the trap of sort of like, you're not allowed, right? Like you can't tolerate everything, because if you tolerate everything, you tolerate like, then bad things get tolerated. So there's like a boundary there, but that's sort of how I try my best to walk through the world, and each of you will strive to do yours as well. Joel, I've seen your hand up for a while, and if there's anyone else.
Yeah, Rabbi, thank you very much. I'd like to say that you asked one of the greatest questions we ever asked: who am I? This question of who am I has been around for centuries. We asked it today. The answer, or a way to answer this, who am I at present? Because we change. But the answer really is, who should I be? And that's what religion and God is about. God is the creator of the moral piece of the universe. Who should I be is rest in the Torah. God is telling you who you should be. This is the way to approach the answer. Who am I? Who am I, but who should you be?
I think that the power of having tenses is really useful there, right? Which is who I was, who I am, and who I might be are all important questions, right? The Gemara tells us that we're not supposed to challenge people about who they were when they've done tshuva or if they've converted or whatever, right? Which just means that there's a boundary there. But for ourselves, we can always ask the question, how did I get here? Who was I that I made XYZ choices to get myself to this moment? And then to your point, Joel, right? There's always the question of, well, who might I be? What decisions can I make today that will impact the person I will be? But I think there's one piece, and this is where I'll push back on you a little bit, which is that the Rambam reminds us when we're talking about sacrifices, is that the distance to who I was and who I will be there's a big distance there. It's a long distance. And that we do need to recognize who we are now in the present so that we can navigate that journey effectively. Meaning to say, yes, you are right. And it's also good to be able to just say, who am I today? Who am I today? What challenges, strengths, weaknesses do I have today? So that I can make as you said, decisions about who I might be. And our tradition offers lots of answers and methods and mechanisms and tools to navigate that journey. And selfishly and I got a total bias, I think ours is pretty good. We've got some good tools in our tool chest, but that all three of those points was, will be, and is are important parts of that journey. And we see that just again, sort of inviting the drash in the words, right? The verb to be in Hebrew is a wonky one, right? It doesn't quite work in all of the tenses exactly the same. It's a funny word. God's name being an example of that word to be being mixed up with all those tenses. Betsy, we're going to give you the last word, or whoever is there.
Thank you. I just want to say God's first question of Adam was, where are you? And so God is calling out to us, calling out, where are you? Who are you? Why are you hiding? What are you hiding? And so I will think about that this week. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. God says, Ayeka, where are you? What's your deal? Exactly right. Right. God is asking us that every day. And so can we ask ourselves that. Thank you all. Have a wonderful, meaningful Passover, as they say, Chag Sameach v'Kasher. I hope all of you have a wonderful Passover and have a great Shabbat Hagadol. I hope that it is very gadol, very great.